in part 2, I talked about Visenya from 1 AC to 11 AC, stopping at the birth of her son Maegor, Aegon the Conqueror's second child and son. In this last part of Visenya's series, I want to talk about her life from 11 AC up until her death, which includes raising Maegor, allegedly poisoning her nephew, and indulging a son that was kind of an asshole. So after 10 years of not producing a child for her husband Aegon, Visenya finally gave birth to a robust boy in 11 AC. I mentioned in part 2 that from the birth of Maegor, Visenya would be his greatest ally, constantly trying to advance him above her nephew's stepson, Aenys. And if you think that made her a shitty person, let's be honest, Aegon played favorites not only with his wives, but then with his children. At this point, Aenys was heir apparent, and always by Aegon's side, just like Maegor would almost always be by Visenya's side after being born. Because Aegon and Visenya were often apart, that meant she did the majority of raising Maegor. While she raised Maegor mostly at Dragonstone, training and teaching him, when Aegon made his royal progresses, Visenya would actually go to King's Landing and hold court. Maegor would follow her because he was always by her side, and stay with her at King's Landing during this time. When Aegon was not on his royal progresses and he returned to King's Landing, Visenya and Maegor would then go to Dragonstone. This led to the realm calling Maegor the Prince of Dragonstone. Now, as you probably got from part 1 and part 2, Visenya was an intense woman, so you can imagine that being basically the sole parent of Maegor, she raised him with that same intensity. Visenya, being the badass she is, decided her son at 3 years old was ready to start training with weapons. Yeah, she put a sword in the hand of Maegor at the age of 3. Stories state the first thing he did was butcher one of the castle cats with the sword, but that can't be proved. Maegor quickly became skilled with the blade, and Visenya appointed Sir Gawain Corbray, about the deadliest knight in the Seven Kingdoms at the time, as his first master at arms. This lady wasn't messing around. Her son became a squire at the age of 8, and by the age of 13 and 25 AC, Maegor was given Visenya's Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister as a name day present. So far, Visenya had raised a child that was very capable of defending himself and others, even if she also raised a child that had a cruelty in him. As an example, at the age of 8, Maegor had stabbed a horse to death for kicking him in the stables, and had done some other not great things. But he was her son, and she wanted great things for him, so Visenya stood by his side. It makes sense that when Aenys and his wife, Alyssa Velaryon, had their firstborn, a girl named Rhaena, that Visenya worried. Until they had children, Maegor was the heir apparent after his brother, the second in line of succession. She wondered, was her son Maegor still second in line? Or would he fall third to the new princess? To settle the matter, Visenya proposed to marry her son Maegor to Aenys' first child. That way, it would become a non-issue. But not only did Aenys and his wife speak out against the match, the two brothers weren't very close, but the idea was shot down so hard by the High Septon, and he put up such a protest, that instead Maegor was married to the High Septon's niece, Lady Cerise of House Hightower, in 25 AC. No children came for Maegor, but Alyssa and the future King Aenys were very fruitful. With every addition to the king's family, Visenya watched her son slip further and further down in the line of succession, something she didn't like at all. But Visenya had other things to worry about. Sadly, Visenya was reminded that she was the least favorite sister wife often. The relationship between Aegon and Visenya had never been a warm one, but after Rhaenys' death, it grew even colder and more distant. When in 35 AC, Aegon decided to tear down the initial palisade to make the Red Keep a castle that would be fit for the Targaryen rulers, he put Visenya in charge of building it. This wasn't because he thought she'd do a great job, though I'm sure he knew she would. Maesters believe he put Visenya in charge of the construction of the Red Keep so that he wouldn't have to be around her while he was at Dragonstone. That's just cold, but at least he never took another wife to make her feel even more unloved. 2 years later, in 37 AC, her husband Aegon would die, and her dragon Vhagar would supply the flames to cremate her husband. With Aegon dead, that meant the crown went to Rhaenys and Aegon's son, Aenys, who was born before Visenya and Aegon's son, Maegor. When Maegor knelt to honor Aenys as the new king, his brother lifted him up, telling him to never kneel to him again, and that they would rule the realm together. Aenys, not being much of a warrior, had gifted Maegor Blackfire, Aegon the Conqueror's sword, telling Maegor he was more fit to wield it, and that if he wielded it in his service, he would be content. Visenya, who obviously wanted her son to rule, was not shy about saying Aenys was unfit to rule, and that by giving Blackfire to her son Maegor, Aenys was admitting he lacked the strength to be king. It's reported that Visenya said, after Aenys became king and gave Blackfire to Maegor, "The truth is plain enough. Even Aenys sees it. Why else would he have given Blackfire to my son? He knows that only Maegor has the strength to rule." Which, she was kinda right. While Aegon and his sister wives had kept the realm in line, their heirs weren't so lucky. Those of the Seven Kingdoms quickly rose up against Aenys during his rule and tried to push the Targaryens out of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon the Conqueror was strong, but they saw weakness in Aenys, and so rebellions broke out all over. Despite the unkind words Visenya had for Aenys as king, when some of these rebellions broke out, Visenya acted on her own and with the help of others to put them down, with her son Maegor helping as well. But things took a turn for the worse for Visenya's son in 39 AC. For a few reasons, but mostly because his wife appeared to be barren, Maegor married again in 39 AC to Alice of House Haraway in secret on Dragonstone. Well, not secret from Visenya, because she was the one that officiated the Valyrian ceremony when no Septon would do it. And do you think the High Septon liked his niece being put aside so Maegor could marry another woman? Hell no. This resulted in King Aenys giving his brother an ultimatum, and Maegor deciding to pick exiling himself in Essos for 5 years. But that wasn't enough. More needed to be done to repair the damage between the faith and the Targaryen rule. And stupidly, while there was still unrest and ill feelings with the faith, Aenys decided to marry his 2 children to each other. This did not go over well in multiple ways. First, Visenya was present at the wedding, and at the feast after the ceremony, King Aenys named his son Aegon Prince of Dragonstone, a title that had belonged to Maegor. Visenya was pissed, to say the least. She left the feast in protest, stalking away from the high table. She then returned to Dragonstone on her dragon Vhagar. If the songs can be believed, the moon turned red as Visenya and her dragon passed it. So, not a great sign. And secondly, why this marriage didn't go over well between Aenys' children was because it was too far for the faith and those that followed it. They had tolerated Aegon and his sister wives, but they would not tolerate Aenys marrying his children together. Shortly after the wedding, the faith militant rose up against Aenys, and he was forced to flee with his family to Dragonstone. Visenya was said to famously greet him, "You are a fool and a weakling, nephew. Do you think any man would have ever dared speak so to your father? You have a dragon. Use him. Fly to Old Town and make this starry Sepp another Harrenhal. Or give me leave, and let me roast this pious fool for you." Vhagar grows old, but her fires still burn hot. Despite Visenya counseling Aenys to bring fire and blood with his dragons to the Starry Sepp and the Sepp of Remembrance, Aenys refused. Instead, he sent Visenya to her chambers in the Sea Dragon Tower and ordered her to remain there. But nobody puts Visenya in the corner. And if I had to guess, this is the moment Visenya put some plans into motion to put her hand in the poison jar. So, shockingly, Aenys soon fell ill on Dragonstone with painful cramps in his stomach and diarrhea. Crazy how you piss off Visenya, someone that dabbled with poisons, and suddenly you become really unwell. When Grand Maester Gwaine couldn't fix him, Visenya, being the caring stepmom aunt she was, took care of poor Aenys. He got better for a bit, but then suddenly collapsed without warning after hearing news of his kids dying 3 days later. In 42 AC, with Aenys' death, Visenya moved into action. Instead of attending his funeral, within an hour of Aenys dying, Visenya took her dragon and flew to Pentos, bringing her son Maegor back to Westeros. Once her and Maegor were back on Dragonstone, she crowned him king and placed the Iron Crown of Aegon I on her son's head, despite Aenys children rightfully being the next in line. Visenya didn't care. Her son was going to rule. And obviously Maegor wasn't torn up about taking his nephew's throne either, because he went along with it. Next, Visenya and Maegor rode their dragons to King's Landing, much to the anger of those in the city. The faith was still strong here, and they had hoped the Targaryens were gone from King's Landing for good. Visenya and Maegor showed them just how wrong they were. Together, they raised the Targaryen standards on Visenya's hill and called for Maegor's loyal men to gather. When they did, Visenya stated Maegor was a true king, blood of Aegon the Conqueror, who was my brother, my husband, and my love. If any man questions my son's right to the Iron Throne, let him prove his claim with his body. Visenya challenged any who believed Maegor wasn't the rightful king to prove themselves, and one man stepped forward to take that challenge, the captain of the warrior's sons. This resulted in a trial of 7. After each side had gathered men to equal 7, Visenya gave the command to begin, and the two sides battled. The trial eventually ended with Maegor being the last man standing. Well, alive. At the end of the trial, Maegor was still on the ground, and some thought him dead. But when Visenya went to him, she found her son alive and still breathing. Discovering this, she declared, "The king breathes. The king lives." Not everyone was happy about this, but since he was the only one alive from the trial, this must have meant the gods wanted Maegor to be king. So who were they to disagree? But Maegor was in rough shape after this trial. Commanding her son to be brought to the maesters as the swords of the faith kneeled to them, Visenya also ordered them to return to their seat atop the Hill of Rhaenys as she focused on her son. Maegor was taken to get medical attention, but the trial resulted in the man going into a coma. Maesters did all they could, but for days on end, Maegor remained unconscious. While the Maesters attended to her son, Visenya commanded the Kingsguard that had arrived from Dragonstone to take command of thousands of Targaryen loyalists in the city and surround the Hill of Rhaenys. She knew that the warriors' sons were torn between obeying Maegor, as he had won the trial, and fighting against him and for the High Septon. On day 28 of Maegor's coma, Maegor's wife Alice came from Pentos with Maegor's lover, Tyanna of the Tower. Apparently Visenya approved of Tyanna, as after meeting her, Visenya gave Maegor's care to the woman and the woman alone. Visenya once again made a fantastic choice, and on day 30, Maegor awoke. Visenya's son was awake and ready to rule his kingdom. Well, the kingdom he stole from his nephews. Sometime later, when Maegor took Tyanna of the Tower for his third wife, some protested, but not his mother, despite the belief that she began to really not like the woman. This may have been for a few reasons, including some moms have a really hard time with other ladies being in their sons' lives, which Maegor would soon collect a lot of ladies, but this video isn't about Maegor. For a time, Maegor as king was said to be ruled by 3 queens, one of which being his mother Visenya, and the other 2 being his wives Alice and Tyanna. Likely seeing her ambition and again not liking her son's ear going to another woman, soon Visenya began to distrust Tyanna, and a rivalry developed between the 2 women. Next, we know in 42 AC, Visenya flew to Driftmark on her dragon to convince Aenys' widow, Alyssa Velaryon, to leave her father's castle and return to King's Landing, which Alyssa actually ended up doing. Then in 43 AC, still absolutely in her son's corner, Visenya would aid her son in taking care of those that refused to answer his royal summons. Taking her dragon, Visenya flew to the Riverlands and set several of the houses there on fire. Visenya and Maegor next decided to focus on the High Septon, who had been very outspoken against Maegor and his many marriages. The mother and son on their dragons threatened to incinerate the Starry Sept, but as fate would have it, the High Septon suddenly died. News Visenya heard first, and Lord Hightower opened the city gates. Funny how a High Septon suddenly dies when Old Town is at risk for being burned down. Which there are those that believe it was actually Visenya who killed the High Septon, but it can't be proven. Thankfully, the new High Septon was much more forgiving of Maegor's many wives. and Visenya watched as he anointed her son and declared him king. Soon afterwards, she returned to Dragonstone with her dragon and left Maegor at Old Town. Visenya would continue to assert her son's rightful place as king from time to time. Guiding him, she at times encouraged him to kill, and at other times, such as after his victory at the battle beneath the God's Eye when Aenys' son rose up to take his rightful crown, she persuaded him to spare the lives of several highborn rebels. Later, after Prince Aegon, Aenys' son, was killed by Maegor, Queen Alyssa and her two youngest children, Alysanne and Jaehaerys, were made Visenya's wards, really prisoners, on Dragonstone by Maegor. There's a lot of blanks on what Visenya did from the time Maegor woke from his coma to her death, so the next thing we know is Visenya passed in 44 AC after she had grown thin and haggard, with those stating it was as if the flesh had melted from her bones. She died while her son was on campaign, and Alyssa and her two children took the opportunity to slip away from the castle and take Visenya's sword Dark Sister with them. Visenya was cremated as tradition with Targaryens, and her bones and ashes were put beside her brother Aegon the Conqueror. Many years after her death, people would be sure it was Visenya that had killed her nephew. Visenya had everything to gain from killing Aenys, and as all could see, she had little pity for fuck-ups. She had been her son's greatest ally from birth, and had always done everything to see him rise higher than Aenys. Some would even call her Kingslayer and Kinslayer after her death. But that is all we know so far of Visenya, one of the first Targaryen queens. Perhaps with the release of Fire and Blood this year, we'll learn a bit more. I'll be putting parts 1 through 3 together at the request of my patrons on Patreon, so you'll see that post soon. Thanks for watching, please like and subscribe.